Good evening, Jessica. Would you like to say a few words, or I can kick it off?
Thanks, Dan. Okay, so today we're going to be going over the City of Modesto housing elements, which is a requirement from the state of California. What we will do is kind of explain what a housing element is, go through the requirements that the City of Modesto is needing to meet, as well as talk about programs that we'll be implementing within the next 8 years. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it back to Dan, who is our consultant over at Michael Baker International.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. Welcome, everybody. And right now I'm going to hand it off to Frida Blum, who's providing live translation in Spanish this evening, and she's got some instructions.
Thank you, Mr. Wary. Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. In order to provide language access, this meeting will have simultaneous bidirectional interpretation, and I'll explain how to enable the feature in Spanish. A efecto de proporcionar acceso lingüístico, esta reunión contará con interpretación simultánea al español. Si usted es bilingüe, no tiene que presionar nada, pero si usted no es bilingüe y está en su computadora, en unos segundos verá un icono en forma de globo en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Haga clic en interpretación de idiomas y después seleccione español o Spanish. Si está en su iPad o su teléfono, entonces busque el menú de 3 puntos o que dice More en una de las esquinas de su pantalla. Haga clic en interpretación y después seleccione español o Spanish. Gracias. Thank you.
Okay. That's it. Okay, great. Okay, great. And then Jessica, I don't know if you want to introduce the team real quick, and then we'll get started.
Great. So in order to complete our housing element, myself, Jessica Hill, is here as the Interim Director of Community and Economic Development. I have Diana Lawrence here, who is our Senior Planner, also the lead for our housing element in this endeavor. And then we have Michael Baker International's team and Dan Weary, who is the lead of that as well.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. And with me tonight is also Hannah Kreitman, and she'll be presenting a number of the slides through the middle of the presentation. And Shannon Liska is running the Zoom in behind and will be available for some of the Q and answer period if we have any questions. So with that, I just want to provide a brief introduction and overview. We've got about 40 slides overall. It'll take about 45 minutes. We'll try to be pretty brief. We do have some interaction for any attendees in the public. We can ask some questions and answers, and then we can discuss those answers as we go along. And at the end of the presentation, we'll have time for open Q&A. I should note that this session is being recorded in both Spanish and English. Again, there'll be an introduction in the background. There'll be a summary of our community engagement process. We're going to describe one of the main components of the housing element, which is called RHNA, or our Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And then we'll get into how we specifically meet the state requirements, which includes identifying sites and programs. And those are the two main components of the housing element. And as I mentioned, there'll be some opportunity for Q&A. So with that, let's get going. So first, what is a housing element? The housing element is one of 9 elements or chapters of the city's general plan. These are required components. Every general plan, they can mix and match these a little bit, so sometimes you don't always have full 9. But throughout the entire general plan, these are the topics that need to be provided. And so housing is unusual or unlike all the other elements in that it's got its own statutory requirement, its own schedule, and needs to be updated and adopted every 8 years, where generally the rest of the housing elements or general plan elements can go for 20, even 30 years. The other requirement is that the state must approve the city's housing element. So that's unlike all the other elements in the general plan as well. And in general, what the housing element does is assess the city's housing needs, any constraints, and housing resources, and then establishes goals and objectives, policies, and specific actions and programs to implement those goals and objectives over the next 8 years. This often includes ensuring that there's adequate zoning and the identification of sites that are suitable to meet the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA, over the next 8 years. And then again, we have specific programs to promote fair housing and to meet, otherwise incentivize and meet those RHNA needs. The other thing is that, as I mentioned before, this must be reviewed by the California Department of Housing and Community Development, otherwise known as HCD. And you'll hear that term HCD a number of times. You'll hear RHNA, which is our Regional Housing Needs Allocation, a number of times as well. So with that, we just wanted to provide a little bit of background about Modesto. So Modesto is currently over roughly 215,000 people, population, and growing. I think by even a more recent count that may have increased since this count of 215, it might be as high as 218. And on the right, you can see how the population is broken down by race and ethnicity. The key point here is that roughly 41% of the city is Hispanic or Latino background, and it's a pretty significant component. And again, fairly typical representation through the other race and ethnicities. A good 29% of the population is under 19 years of age, so mostly minors, and 15% of the population is 65 and over. And we noted that 60 to 74 year age group has grown quite a bit since the last census, as you would expect. But as a percentage of the city, it is growing. With that, also, we want to talk about the number of housing units. That's what we're all about here for tonight's discussion. There's over 71,000 housing units in the city of Modesto. That averages out with the population to be just over 3 persons per household. And one thing that we looked at there is how many units are owner occupied and how many are occupied by renters. And it's actually pretty even, 56-44%. We also look at the household incomes, and these are the median household income here is just under $74,000. And then we also look at the median affordable price, and affordability, we'll get into it in a little bit more detail, but generally it's recommended that households not spend more than 30, or ideally not spend around 30% of their gross household income on housing. And that makes sure that you've got money for all your other essential needs. Unfortunately, the median home price in Modesto is just about $500,000. So almost twice what a median household can afford. And that's why we prepare these plans, because we've got this gap and this need for more housing and more affordable housing. And I mentioned that 30%, again, that's considered, any more than that's considered overpayment or cost burdened. Many people are paying more than 30%. I'd almost argue that most are. If you start paying more than 50%, that's kind of an extreme overpayment or cost burden. So we as part of the housing element, we look at all these stats and figures, and they're available. If you go online, you can see that. The draft housing element is out and available for your review. And there's lots of stats and facts and analysis in there. And we'll hit some of these highlights tonight. So I think we have one, and we don't. So we are going to ask some questions of our audience. And some of these questions are very similar to ones that are available online. There's an online survey that we encourage everybody to take. And a few slides later, we're going to provide links to that. And so if we had members of the public, we would have them answer this question. But at the moment, we don't have any attendees. So I'm going to skip through these questions. And again, these will be available on the online survey. So the question was, who's listening in English or Spanish? We just want to get an idea of who's in attendance. Oh, we do have one attendee. Okay, great. Thank you, Carlos. I'll call you out. If you can take the answer, and you did, that's great. You're answering in English. Thank you very much. And we'll go to our next slide. So our next question is, how long have you lived or worked in the city of Modesto? Less than 5 years, 5 to 10 years, more than 10 years, or maybe you don't live or work in Modesto. You might just be an interested party and interested in what's happening in Modesto. So I look forward to seeing your answers there. If we can answer the question, we'll pop it up. There we go. So more than 10 years, great. And that's pretty common. We find that we have higher response rates amongst people who have lived in the community longer, and they tend to be more aware and involved in these types of workshops. So the next one we have is, if I can get my cue to go. There we go. Just, are you an owner, a renter? Perhaps you rent property, you might be a landlord, and maybe again, maybe you just work or do something else in the city. Often we have advocates. So if you can answer that question, we appreciate it. I'm sorry, I keep looking off to the side because it answers are on my other screen. Okay. I believe you can answer more than one. Okay. I didn't see the answers, but we didn't get any. Okay. And there we go. Other. Very good. Thank you. And I believe this is our last question. What type of housing do you live in? Single family, accessory dwelling unit, duplex, triplex, quadplexes. Those are basically small multifamily, condominium, apartment building. Maybe it's a mobile home. Could be senior housing or assisted or group housing or other. And if it's other, if you can use the Q&A, you can type in the answer. We appreciate that. And I should note at any time, if you use the Q&A button in the Zoom, you can ask questions, you can type them out. We've got those open and we can answer those as we go along through the presentation or at the end of the presentation. We'll try to catch any that we haven't answered along the way. So single family, great, thank you. And I think we have one last question. Okay, and just where do you live or work in Modesto? Hopefully you can see where you are on this map. We really just broke it into these six areas. And we have large groups. This just helps us kind of understand who we're talking to. And again, we'll ask similar questions in the online survey. Okay, one more second. Very good. And I don't know if we got an answer. Very good. And we're unsure. Okay. Well, thank you very much. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Hannah, and she's going to provide an overview of our community engagement and some overview of the background and general parameters of what's in the housing element.
Thanks, Dan. So this will just be a quick overview of what kinds of community engagement we've conducted and what we will continue to conduct for the update of the city's housing element. Community engagement helps the city understand what issues need to be addressed in their general plan update. To ensure robust engagement, all materials and presentations are provided in both English and Spanish. Information and community engagement plan activities include a city webpage and informational flyers, as well as stakeholder interviews. We've held 4 stakeholder focus groups on May 23rd, 24th, and 31st, as well as June 8th. We reached out to over 35 individuals and organizations, of which 13 participated. The 13 participants represented 10 different agencies and community-based organizations, such as educational, community outreach, fair housing, property managers, environmental, and affordable housing developers. The online community survey is now open and will remain open through October. We have 2 community workshop presentations scheduled. The first is tonight, and the second will be on Wednesday, July 12th. The draft housing element update was published June 16th and will remain open for comment through July 17th per the 30-day minimum set by state law. We will have 2 public hearings at the Planning Commission and City Council prior to adoption scheduled for the end of 2023. Information about the housing element update is on the city's website with links to the online community survey in both English and Spanish. We'll have QR links on the following slide as well as at the end of the presentation. We need your input. As previously stated, the survey will remain open through October of this year. We've had 65 respondents so far, 64 in English and 1 in Spanish. It's anonymous and takes less than 10 minutes to take. Your input is very important and helpful in developing the housing element to understand and identify the housing and related needs of the community, issues residents are facing, constraints to housing development, priority actions and programs. Please go to the website as shown on the previous page or capture the QR code shown here to participate in the online survey. Please share these opportunities with your family and friends to help us reach and hear from as many people as possible. We'll show these QR codes again at the end of the presentation. This is the Housing Element Update process. We are currently in the Draft Housing Element Update and Program stage, which is the second box. The Draft Housing Element Update will be submitted to HCD for its 90-day review at the end of July. Public review will continue throughout the entire process through the end of 2023. I'm now going to give some background on the Housing Element Update and what it means for Modesto. The housing element ensures that the general plan provides enough opportunity for housing development for people of all income levels, identities, and life stages, including special needs populations, such as homeless individuals, seniors, veterans, and people with disabilities. It ensures that housing development is not being precluded due to lack of land zoned for housing, and that enough land is zoned and suitable to accommodate both large and small multifamily developments, as well as single-family homes. This is also referred to as housing capacity. As part of the update, the city is required to evaluate what land is available for development to ensure it has the capacity to produce housing for households of all incomes throughout the 2023 to 2031 housing element cycle. The capacity the city must ensure it has the capacity for is determined by the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA, which I will describe on the next slide. Every 8 years, the California Department of Housing and Community Development, or HCD, issues a quantity of housing units by income level, reflective of the housing need of a region, to each Council of Governments, or COG. The COG then allocates a portion of this Regional Housing Needs Allocation, or RHNA, to each jurisdiction in the COG region. In the case of the City of Modesto, this allocation was made by the Stanislaus Council of Governments, or STAN-COG. The RHNA is broken down into 5 income categories to evaluate housing need based on the Area Median Income, or AMI, for each metropolitan statistical area. Each jurisdiction must then draft a housing element to demonstrate the capacity for the allocated RHNA, or the city's share of the regional housing needs. Modesto's total RHNA is 11,248 lower, moderate, and above moderate income units. There are 6 main chapters in a housing element. The first is the review of past accomplishments, which reviews the 2015 to 2023 housing element and evaluates progress on housing goals, objectives, and policies, and determines the effectiveness of these policies, and describes how they will be incorporated in the 2023 to 2031 housing element. The element also reviews progress towards meeting the 2015 to 2023 RHNA and effectiveness at serving special needs populations. Next is the housing needs assessment. The needs assessment evaluates characteristics that inform housing need, including population trends, demographics, employment trends, household characteristics, housing stock characteristics, housing inventory and market conditions, and preservation of at-risk units. The assessment also analyzes housing needs of various special needs groups, including elderly persons, large households, female-headed households, persons with disabilities, including developmental disabilities, homeless persons, farm workers, and extremely low-income households. The AFFH chapter, or Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing chapter, analyzes barriers that restrict access to opportunities and identifies goals to address impacts of systemic issues such as residential segregation, housing cost burden, and unequal educational or employment opportunities to the extent these issues create and or perpetuate discrimination against protected segments of the population. Constraints on housing identifies and evaluates factors that may pose significant constraints or burdens that limit or constrain the production of housing to meet our local and regional housing needs and the goals and objectives of the general plan. The Sites and Resources section provides an overview of available land resources and residential sites for future housing development and evaluates how these resources can satisfy future housing needs. It also reviews financial and administrative resources available to support affordable housing and discusses resources available for the development, rehabilitation, and preservation of housing in Modesto. The chapter identifies specific sites with capacity to meet the RHNA. The inclusion of a site does not require the jurisdiction or landowner to build or finance housing on the site. Suitable sites are selected only to demonstrate the capacity for housing. The Goals, Policies, and Programs chapter includes programs that the city will implement over the next 8 years. Each program has an action, a timeline to complete the action, funding source, implementing agency, and where applicable, a quantified objective or geographic target for the program. The City of Modesto's Community Development Division, or CDD, is largely the implementing agency for housing element programs. The Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, or AFFH chapter, is a new requirement for housing elements that was added by Assembly Bill 686 in 2018. AFFH means taking meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities. The housing element will have an entire section dedicated to furthering fair housing. The AFFH chapter must analyze the following components: fair housing enforcement and outreach capacity, segregation and integration patterns, any analysis of racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty and affluence, and it will consider if there are any disparities in access to opportunities, which can include access to high-quality employment, education, and healthcare. The element must also consider if there are any groups that face disproportionate housing needs or are subject to displacement risks. Finally, the city must identify meaningful goals, policies, and actions to further fair housing. These actions must include specific metrics, timelines, and other evaluation criteria to help track progress. The compliance of the City of Modesto's housing element is due on December 31st, 2023. If the housing element is not found in compliance by December 31st, the city will be subject to builder's remedy until the housing element is found in compliance. This means proposed affordable housing projects where 20% of units are lower income, or 100% of units are moderate income, or emergency shelters, would not be subject to the city's zoning code or general plan land use designations. The city may be required to approve these affordable projects unless the project has a specific adverse effect on public health, is in violation of state or federal law, is proposed on land zoned for agriculture or resource preservation, or does not have adequate water or sewer facilities to serve the project. If Modesto's housing element is not found in compliance by HCD by the end of the 120-day grace period on April 29th, 2024, the city may be vulnerable to litigation, loss of local permitting authority, and loss of state or federal funding, which may include disqualification of eligibility for certain state grants, a carryover of the current RHNA units to the next cycle, fines and penalties, or a risk of lawsuit. I'm going to hand it back to Dan to summarize the RHNA strategy and programs for the City of Modesto.
Awesome. Thank you, Hannah. Okay, so real quick, Hannah's given us a good definition and described and defined in great detail what the RHNA is, Regional Housing Need Allocation. Now I'm going to describe some of the requirements and the plans to meet that. And as you may have understood by now, the RHNA is our primary numerical metric and definitive requirement that each city or county must demonstrate to this, satisfaction of the state Housing, Community, and Development Department. So how do we get our RHNA? The state crunched a bunch of numbers way back when and determined that they need approximately 1.4 million new units over the next 8 years, or this 6th cycle housing element period. And that was then distributed out to each of the regions. And in this case, Stanislaus County is our local region. And Stanislaus County got 34,344 of those units. Those were then further subdivided to each of the cities and the county, unincorporated county. And the city of Modesto got the largest share in Stanislaus County, which is 11,248 new units over the next 8 years. So again, it's state, region, which is the county, and then down to each individual city and unincorporated county. Everybody gets their fair share. So this table really just compares the current fifth cycle housing element requirements, which will be ending, that cycle ends December 31st and the new one begins December 31st. So you can see from the fifth cycle that will finish at the end of this year, we have a requirement to provide 6,747 total units, or provide capacity for those total units. And in the sixth cycle, you can see that number is increased 67% to 11,248 units. In the columns, you can see the individual requirements by income level, from very low in the far left column to low, moderate, and above moderate. So there's specific requirements and targets that we need to meet for each income level, as well as that total number. And again, overall, they've all adjusted up or down, or in this case, everybody's increased approximately 67%. And that's consistent. Overall, the state is looking for 80% increase over the last cycle. So Stanislaus County actually, in proportion, got a relatively smaller share than other regions. And then we look at the affordability by income. As I mentioned before, affordability is generally defined as spending not more than 30% of the total or gross household income on rent, purchase, mortgage, or interest, and insurance. And this table shows a range of incomes and maximum affordable rent and purchase price. These are set by HUD, Housing Urban Development, and HCD, Housing, and that's the state Housing and Community Development Department. And these are numbers for Stanislaus County based on a 4-person household. These numbers vary depending on the number of household sizes, but typically we just use the 4-person household as a good target. And so what we see here is the individual income levels, and these are defined by HUD and the state. And so they go from extremely low, very low, and low. Together we call those lower. Then there's moderate, and then there's above moderate. And these are all based on a percentage or ranges relative to the median household income, and that's at that bottom row there. So the median household income, as I mentioned before, is just about $74,000 in Stanislaus County. And if we were to divide that out in terms of what's affordable, if we were to spend 30% of that gross income, that would translate to about $1,850 for rent, or a purchase price of about $248,000 for a home or a condo or whatever. And then if you look at the individual rows, you can see each of those income levels, there's ranges. For example, low income is 50% or less than, it's 50 to 80, less than 80% of the median income. Very low is 50 to 80, and extremely low is 35% or lower. I think I got that right, sorry. Moderate income is generally 80 to 120% of that area median income, and above moderate is anything over 120% of that area median income. Anyway, it shows the values here, and the key point here is that a typical household of 4 in Stanislaus County should be able to afford about $850 for rent at 30% of their gross income, or about $250,000 of a purchase price. The real wrinkle is that a median home is ranging nearly $500,000, or almost double what a median household can afford. So that's a gap that we're trying to solve. And this is not unique to Stanislaus County. This is very common throughout the state. So with the RHNA allocations, there's a number of different factors that we need to consider. First of all, the city's obligation is to provide sufficient land, that's land that's zoned appropriately, to accommodate this RHNA allocation of 11,248 units. The city is not obligated to construct housing or to finance housing. The city must demonstrate the likelihood of housing construction over the next 8 years. And we do that in a number of different ways in the housing element. And we must always maintain enough adequate land, appropriately zoned land and sites to meet that RHNA during this 8-year planning period. And as part of this process, we identify specific sites that meet all the eligibility criteria established by the state. We provide assumptions and projections for each site in terms of the number of units that may produce over the next 8 years. We try to be conservative about that. Then we keep track of that. And over the 8-year period, the city needs to maintain the number of sites. And what happens if any site is developed at a lower density or a higher income level than what was projected, we need to, that's called a net loss of capacity. And that net loss of capacity needs to be replaced. And so the city must maintain this inventory over the 8 years to make sure that we've got enough to meet that RHNA during the whole process. And to deal with that, we also, it's not required, but it's highly recommended that we include a buffer when we develop our site's capacity. And the reason is that any deficit that occurs when a property is developed, if it falls below what was projected, that needs to be made up within 6 months. And sometimes that can mean rezoning or upzoning land to a higher density. And that can often take longer than 6 months. So to avoid that complication and remain in compliance with law, we usually provide a buffer anywhere between 15 and 30%. It's important to note that listing or mapping a property as a RHNA site does not require the city or the property owner to develop the property. It merely demonstrates the capacity and the adequacy of that site to qualify and meet the requirements and demonstrate the ability to meet the RHNA. So that's an important point. In terms of the inventory requirements, there's a number of things that we look at when we identify the individual sites. First of all, we look at what's a realistic capacity. What that isn't is taking the maximum development potential by zoning. So if you've got a 10-acre property and it's zoned for 30 dwelling units per acre, and you did the math, that'd be a maximum potential of 300 units. We know it's unlikely that you'll reach 300 units on every property. So we look at demonstrated trends that have occurred over the last planning period and use those trends as projections going forward. And often we'll find a trend is 75 to 85% of capacity on average. Some are higher, some are lower. And we take that average trend and use that to determine our realistic capacities going forward. And then each site has certain requirements. So, and again, there's individual income levels that we're trying to meet. And the lower income levels need to be on sites between 1/2 acre and 10 acres. That's a figure that was established by the state since the last housing element. And they just found that that's a kind of a sweet spot for providing affordable housing. So that's something else we have to look at, is the size of the property. Then we look at the infrastructure to make sure that there's adequate infrastructure that can support the development of that property up to its maximum potential. So we look at water, wastewater, dry utilities. And again, lower density properties, it's okay, they can still rely on septic, but most of the city of Modesto is going to have sewer. Only in the unincorporated areas are you really seeing areas that would be on septic system. And then we look at the suitability of the land itself. Are there any environmental constraints and restrictions? Sometimes there's steep slopes, floodplains, and there can be protected habitats and other constraints that might limit the ability to develop a piece of land. So we try to look at those and filter those out to make sure, again, we've got suitable properties. Then we look at the near-term development opportunity. Is the property vacant, which makes it a lot easier to develop, or is it already developed with something and maybe needs to be redeveloped? And if it's been recently developed with a brand new house, it's very unlikely you're going to knock that house down and put in several more houses. But we look at properties and see if they're underutilized. Maybe we look at their age and we see what types of uses are in there, if there's vacancies. And those are indications that the property may be suitable or ripe for development over the next 8 years. And then we look at furthering fair housing. And Hannah went through and gave a really good description of what that is. But overall, we're looking to demonstrate that the sites are furthering fair housing and generally avoid concentrating new housing, particularly low and moderate housing in groups. We want them kind of distributed throughout the town we want them close to good resources and opportunities. So housing would be near good schools, employment, transportation, education facilities, and other factors. So that's some of the things that we have to go through when we're preparing our sites. And on this slide, this kind of breaks down our strategy and our approach. And on the right, you can see the actual map of Modesto that includes all of the sites that we've identified thus far. These are subject to change, but we feel pretty confident. And these sites meet that RHNA requirement. And so we've got them kind of grouped in various areas. There's a couple of corridors along the center. We've got, and then we've also got some mixed use areas. And generally those colors represent the income levels or the density that is allowed on these properties or proposed on these properties. So as I mentioned before, we start off with identifying these sites. We have existing general plan and zoning. What areas allow the densities that we need to meet our RHNA requirements? And I'm not sure if I mentioned, but density is a proxy for affordability in accordance with the state. And for the city of Modesto and other fairly large cities, a density of 30 dwelling units per acre or more, that's allowed by zoning, then that can count towards our very low and our low income requirements. And so you see in that magenta color where it says lower, excuse me, in the legend, and you see that spread out through the town. That bright pink or magenta is the areas that have the appropriate or proposed density to meet these densities of 30 dwelling units or more. The green and the darker purple represent lower density. Those are kind of the moderate or lower density areas or zones, and areas that would be that can qualify for meeting our moderate and above moderate income requirements. So with that, we look at their zoning, and then we look at our recent and pending projects. So most cities have projects going through the application and development approval review stages. And any projects that are pending or recently approved and haven't been completed as of June 30th, so just a couple of weeks ago, or a week ago, are eligible to count towards meeting our RHNA. And so you'll see in, I think, the next slide or next couple of slides, we show that we've got about 3,700 units that are currently pending, either gone through or recently approved or still going through the approval process. And we're able to subtract that out of that total RHNA because we can count on those in the next 8 years. We're also able to count ADUs or accessory dwelling units. These are generally small units, usually about 1,000 square feet or less. They're often known as granny flats, mother-in-law apartments, garden apartments, garage apartments. Often people convert a garage, and they're often in the backyard of a single-family home. Again, we can project based on past trends, and we're able to count those towards meeting our RHNA. After we do that, we have kind of a remaining or unmet RHNA, and then we have to add and identify specific sites like shown on this map. And those are broken down into vacant and underutilized or non-vacant sites. And we also look at the commercial corridors. Those provide a good opportunity because they provide access to transportation, jobs, and services, and more intensive uses, and can generally support higher density residential development. And again, we also look at the distribution to these, and there's a whole series of maps in the AFFH chapter of the housing element where we evaluate these sites in relation to other environmental, educational, and employment factors that help demonstrate that these are in good and suitable locations. So that's generally our RHNA sites approach. And on the next slide here, this is our housing plan in a table form. And so from left to right, we have our columns, and that's our rows. That's just an identifier, our categories, And then we have those RHNA requirements by income level and our total RHNA. So at that top row, you see our RHNA, and we need 2,800 very low, 1,900 lower income, 1,980 moderate, et cetera, for a total of 11,248. And as I mentioned before, we're able to subtract out the pending projects and the ADUs. That gives us our unmet demand. That's row D. Then we apply our buffer to that unmet or remaining RHNA, and we're, in this case, applying a 15% buffer, and that gives us our target. And then so we go to work and we find all the suitable sites in row G, H, and I, and we calculate these projections based on past trends and suitability and size and land use and all those factors. And we're able to project out how many units are likely or possible within the next 8 years. And that gives us our total capacity. So in this case, we've got a total capacity projected to be 12,472 units. If you look at the bottom row, you can see that we've met our target of having a minimum of 15% buffer. And so we've got 16% for the very low and low income categories, 19% in the moderate, and again, 15% for the above moderate income areas. So we're nicely balanced. So it's a lot of words, but that's the crux of, it's roughly half of the housing plan. We've identified the sites and the capacity. And this site just shows a little more detail what was on that map. You can see that we've got the two corridors along Sisk Avenue and McHenry, I was going to say McCormick. And then we've got a couple of mixed use areas over here in kind of the southeast quadrant. And those are kind of some of and then the downtown area has quite a good percentage of units in there. And again, you can see the colors in here by income category, lower, moderate, above moderate, and mix. So in some sites where they're larger, in particular, we show a mix and a range of units. So again, that's roughly half the challenge. The other half is developing policies and programs to make sure that we can get those sites and provide kind of set the table and make them likely to occur over the next 8 years. And so with that, we've developed and we carry over programs from the last housing element. We evaluate those. Some are met and completed and they don't carry over. Some are renewed and amended and brought into this housing element. In total, and then we've added new ones. So in total, we have about 41 proposed housing programs. And they generally are broken down into 6 categories. And they are housing production, constraint removal, housing conservation and preservation, special needs housing, affirmatively furthering fair housing, and community outreach and education, or engagement, also includes education. And let's see, I've got some examples of these, but really quickly, housing production, that's the RHNA, making sure that we are providing the appropriately zoned and planned land to meet our RHNA requirements. And we've got a number of different ways to do that. So we've got some rezoning programs, so we need to increase the density in certain areas throughout the town. We're going to make sure that there's funding available. There's federal funds that come through the state and down to the city that are available to help provide affordable housing. The city is proposing a housing trust fund, which will help fund and can help fund the construction of affordable housing. And there's other programs and incentives. For example, accessory dwelling units are, we've got some incentives, some streamlining, some fee reduction, and in some cases, providing some increased density bonuses beyond what is required by the state. And these are incentives to target specific uses that or housing needs for the city. Constraint removal in general, that can be providing objective design standards. That just makes it easier and more certain for developers and property owners to go through the process. It saves them time and money. It removes risk. And then makes it easier to invest in new housing. There's also a reasonable accommodations procedure that's proposed. And that's just, if somebody can't comply with the building code, there's always exceptions and modifications. So there's going to be a procedure for that. Housing conservation, this is really just to make sure that once we build the housing, it stays in good shape, and for the foreseeable future, it's available for future households and to meet future housing needs. So once we build it, we want to keep it and keep growing that inventory. And so there's some programs in there to provide assistance to homeowners to maintain their properties and do some necessary repairs, keep it in good shape. There's also $20 million in affordable housing resources that's coming to the city, and the city is committed to support affordable housing, and that can include funding for homelessness programs to address that. And then affirmatively furthering fair housing, there's a variety of geographically located improvements, particularly in the county islands in the southern and western portions of Modesto, that will help kind of provide equity between currently the city and the unincorporated portions of the county. And then the community engagement and outreach, there's a variety of different programs to make sure there's education programs for homeowners and tenants. And these are materials and information that's provided in English and Spanish, and if necessary, any other languages. So some of the examples, again, I think I covered some of these. I mentioned density bonus for sample housing programs. The state requires a mandatory density bonus for projects that include affordable housing, and many cities will go above and beyond that to provide additional incentives, particularly if they provide the housing that's really needed in the city. So it's a way to kind of target available resources. As I mentioned, there's a variety of incentives. Some of the housing types that are targeted for various incentives, and that's usually streamlining, fee reduction, simplification, objective standards, are accessory dwelling units, SB9 units, and missing middle. That's kind of that middle density, often duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, smaller multifamily projects that can kind of fit into relatively low scale, lower density neighborhoods. And then permit processing. We're looking for ways to expedite affordable housing. So we were going to have a couple of Zoom poll questions. We still have an attendee, so we'll go ahead and ask these questions. We've got two questions, and it's really the heart of this, which is, what are the top 3 housing issues facing people in Modesto? So we have insufficient housing supply, difficulty paying rent, lack of suitable or needed housing types. That could be size, or how maybe it's senior housing or disability, ADA accessibility, substandard housing, housing segregation and discrimination, access to transit, overcrowding, homelessness, or other. So we try to give you a full range of options. These are key questions that we also asked on the online survey, and we encourage you to take the online survey, and we'll have a link to those in a little bit, again, at the end of this presentation. So our answers are insufficient housing supply, difficulty paying rent, and lack of suitable or needed housing types. So those are great. I appreciate the response there. The next question is, the key question is, okay, we've identified issues. What are the top 3 programs that the city can do to improve housing access or capacity or availability in Modesto? So again, what can the city do to help address these issues? So some sample answers, and you can always provide other, are extend price control period on existing affordable units. Most affordable units come with a 30 or 55 year, depending if they're homeowner or renter units. So they're guaranteed to be affordable for those periods, and we try to extend those. Providing incentives for developers that restrict a portion of the units for affordable housing. I mentioned some density bonuses. That's one of the incentives that's required by the state. Require affordable housing in new developments. So often cities will require tract housing over a certain size to provide a certain number to be affordable. And we got answers. And let's look at the answers. So simplify the process to approve projects. So that's what we call streamlining. And actually, Modesto is pretty good based on our review. Provide access to low-cost pre-designed plans for accessory dwelling units. We've seen a lot of success with that. A lot of communities have done that. And in the last few years, we've seen a big jump in the number of accessory dwelling units being built. And those units are often rented at low cost to family members, friends, small households, students, teachers, firefighters, things like that, people like that, and also provide some additional income for the homeowner. So that's great. And then other, I'm not sure if we got an explanation for other, but appreciate the responses there. So those are really good. That's very helpful. With that, we just want to conclude that's really the most of our presentation. We want to cover the schedule and next steps. So we're at the top of this chart. It's July 6th. This is community workshop number 1. And we will have another workshop, pretty much the same presentation next Wednesday, July 12th, same time, same place. And then we note here the public review draft of the draft housing element has been available since June 16th. That will be available for public comment and review through July 17th, at which point we're going to take those comments, make revisions and responses to those, reflect those comments and questions in the revised draft, and submit that to the state HCD. And the state gets 90 days. They can do it quicker, but they're generally going to use all 90 days that are available to them. So from July 31st to October 29th, the draft housing element will be at the state being reviewed. We may have opportunity for some additional input during that period. The online survey will be open through that whole period. So I encourage you to take that. When we get back, we'll get comments from HCD at the end of October, and then we'll evaluate those comments. HCD will give us a letter and undoubtedly ask for more revisions. And then we'll go through this process again. We'll make revisions, we'll make it available for public review again, and then submit it again back to HCD for another review and hopeful approval. Most likely what we're planning to do is take this to the Planning Commission and City Council for adoption by the end of the year. So we are tentatively scheduled for November 6th, Planning Commission. So we hope to have our revised draft in response to the HCD comments available in time for that. That'll be available for public review before that hearing. And then after the Planning Commission, we'll take those comments. It's possible we'll make even further revisions, and then we'll present again at the tentatively scheduled December 5th City Council hearing. So we're trying to avoid the holidays, but that would enable us to meet our statutory deadline of December 31st, and that's part of the plan. So with that, there's plenty of opportunity for further comments, and we can take some comments and questions from our participants tonight. And we have here on this slide links to the online survey, both in English and in Spanish. So you can use the QR code, or you can go to the website, or you can link on these slides. I will note that this is being recorded, this presentation, and a PDF version will also be hosted with the recorded version of this presentation on the city's website. And more information will be included on the city's website as this project proceeds. You can see at the bottom, you can also go to the website. That third QR code will take you there, or you can just navigate there. If you have any troubles, you can also contact Diana Lawrence at the email on this page and at the phone number 209-571-5267. And I believe we are in the process of including a sign-up list for further information on the city website, so you can link there and provide your email or contact if you'd like to be notified of future opportunities and when future drafts are provided. So with that, we have a thank you. So we have one comment. Carlos, thank you very much. Thank you for attending and your patience and participation. So if there's any other questions, we can take those now. And again, at any time, you can submit questions and comments through the website, or you can contact Diana Lawrence directly. We kind of encourage you to use the website. There's going to be a new email that will help us track all the comments specifically for the housing element update. So with that, that is our presentation. It is 7 o'clock. And again, Carlos, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in the Q&A button on the Zoom panel, and we can read those questions. But if not, they've been answered, we can close the meeting. Thank you very much.